Welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to this public meeting of the Culinary Historians of San Diego. I'm Martin Lindsay. I'm board chair for the Culinary Historians of San Diego, and we're a nonprofit charitable organization dedicated to educating people about the history of food and how it relates to culture and pretty much every other facet of our lives. Membership benefits the San Diego Public Library's collection and helps us present talks like this one. Ordinarily, these are in person talks at the San Diego downtown San Diego Public Library. We have free public meetings, lectures, slideshows, things like that. Most third Saturdays of the month. Although now we're all doing them online like everyone else. Until we can get back into the theater there. Our next presentation will be online February 20th. We're going to be having Christina Sleeper talking about jamming through the ages, the history of preserving foods. I have everybody on mute right now for this large meeting, so if you have any questions, hold them until the end, or just go ahead and post them in the Q&A panel, which is located on the bottom of your Zoom screens. And then we'll address them at the end of the talk. We'll have a Q&A session at the end. I will be monitoring the chat, so if you're having technical problems or something like that, we'll try and figure them out. But right now, I have actually, I also should also say we're recording this and it will be online on our website, chsandiego.org or culinaryhistoriansofsandiego.com if you want to type it all out. But right now I have the pleasure of introducing the Reverend Sharon Sheffield, who will be giving us a guided tour of the high points of Western Christianity's impact on food, with brief excursions into food customs, folklore, and fasting as an expression of faith. I'm really interested to learn more about the beer fasts, soul cakes, sin eaters, and the Great Unleavened Bread Debate. Reverend Sharon Sheffield is the vicar of St. Thomas of Canterbury Episcopal Church in Long Beach, California. She holds degrees in divinity, linguistics, and anthropology, with an emphasis on how myth and folk tale shape society and vice versa. In her free time, Sharon enjoys music, drama, historical reenactment, to help people learn more about odd bits of religious and social history. So without further ado, take it away, Reverend.
All right. Thank you very much, Martin.
You're welcome.
Let me get our slideshow up and running here. There we go.
All right.
So thank you for taking the time to be here this morning. I want to take us all on a guided tour of some of the ways that Christianity has influenced the way we eat or don't eat. Throughout history, food and organized religion have been tied together. What you eat or don't eat, what food is consumed, and with whom are some of the markers of community. And so it stands to reason that religious communities are no different in this regard. But because Christianity has had such an impact on Western culture, we do some things today that we may not realize have their origins in Christian traditions. So this lecture is a guided tour of some of the high points of food and history over the last 2 millennia, looking at what food customs were like in the Jewish communities of Jesus's time, how the church has looked at and dealt with food and fasting, some of the reactions to the church's attitudes, and then just some fun facts and anecdotes that I thought you all would enjoy. Obviously, I can't possibly cover this entire topic in an hour, so I did make up a resource list that Martin had available, and I hope you will use it to do some investigating on your own, because the books on that list will give you hours of reading and reflecting pleasure, and some of them even have recipes that you can try out if you're so inclined. Hello, next, there we go. In order to understand the impact of Christianity on food, you first need to know what people were eating at the time. So I want to start out with what the typical diet was for Jewish people around the time that Jesus lived. And I'm going to put in a caveat here that will save us a whole bunch of time. I'm going to refer to a number of historical persons and to traditional ideas of the church as I understand their veracity and impact. I can't help it because I have a distinct belief system, as everyone does, whether or not your system is sacred or secular. I know that not everyone here shares my religious beliefs, and so please believe me when I say I'm not trying to push them on you when I say Jesus said or Paul did. It just saves a whole lot of time during the lecture. The early Christians considered themselves to be a Jewish sect and kept many of the old customs for several generations, at least until after the fall of the Second Temple in 70 Common Era. So what the early church influenced at first was a diet which reflected the geography of the Near East, the specific Jewish customs, and the overlay of the Roman occupation. If we're talking about the diet of the majority of people, meaning anyone who wasn't extremely wealthy, whether Jewish, Greek, or Roman, the diet was largely vegetarian, consisting of vegetables, grains, fruits, dairy products, and fish, with meat mainly consumed at festivals and holidays. Interestingly, people also generally only ate 2 meals a day, one at or near noon during the heat of the day when work was more difficult, and one at or near sundown. Eating 2 meals a day generally carried on throughout the Renaissance in much of Europe, in fact, and was especially prevalent in the monastic tradition, which I'll be speaking about shortly. Breakfast as a full meal is really a modern invention. And one of the things you need to know is that in Jewish tradition, bread and wine were at virtually every meal. They were common staples of life, and in fact were almost always the first part of the meal, and were blessed when the meal began. This tradition continues today in the Sabbath meal in observant Jewish households, and it is also reflected in the Eucharist of the church, and in the church meals which followed Eucharist, about which I will also be speaking shortly. There are numerous biblical references to common foods and to feasting, and I want to highlight just a few. In Genesis 18, where Abraham and Sarah entertain the Lord and his servants, they serve them bread, curds, and roast meat. So they're serving a holiday or festival meal. In 2 Kings, Elisha purifies a poisoned pot of stew and feeds 100 men with 20 loaves made of barley. In Genesis 25, when Esau sells his birthright, it's for bread and pottage, which is a fairly typical meal of the time, and again, a meal that continues right through the Renaissance and into the early 1900s. Pottage, soup, and stew are your basic meal when what you have to cook with is an open fire and a pot. And that's most of Europe and the Middle East for most of history, again, if you're not really wealthy. Meat was, of course, eaten by Jews, Greeks, and Romans alike. All 3 cultures sacrificed animals to their gods, and all 3 cultures ate the meat afterwards. The difference in part was what meat was being eaten. Beef was eaten by Greeks and Romans, but usually only at a major festival or celebration, as beef was more costly than sheep or goats. Goat was widely consumed throughout the Mediterranean and continued in the Jewish tradition, but fell out of favor in the early church, perhaps because of the biblical association with Satan and evil, as in the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25. Sheep were also eaten throughout the area, but was especially popular in Jewish communities because of the Passover lamb. Interestingly enough, lamb continued to be a big part of Christian eating. Let me say that sentence again. Lamb continued to be a big part of the Christian diet, despite the association of Jesus as the Lamb of God. You'd think that Christians would have stopped eating lamb, yet they continued to do so. Perhaps it's because in the Eucharist we're already consuming the body and blood of Christ. So what's another lamb? Or the church may just have thought that they couldn't lose both of their primary resources. People are real practical that way. In any event, lamb continued to be eaten by Christians and goat pretty much didn't. And this means today that unless you're in an area with a large African or Indigenous American population, you probably don't see goat in your supermarket on a regular basis. So again, we're talking about a basic diet of grains, root vegetables, beans, eggs, cheese, milk, fish, fruit, and occasional four-legged meat. An important thing to note as we move into the topic of foods important to the early church is that fruit, vegetable, and to a lesser extent fish have generally been allowable throughout the church in all its regions and for virtually the entire calendar year. I'll talk at length about feasting and fasting and how many days you either feasted or fasted as church traditions grew. For now, just keep in mind that fruit, vegetables, and especially grains and breads are always allowable foods in both Jewish and Christian tradition. And in part, this is because they're the only way to consume enough calories if you keep a strict fast with no animal products whatsoever, as was often the case during the last 2,000 years. Think for a moment about what it's like to live in a time and a place where there are no supermarkets and no way to get fresh foods out of season as we do now. And then think about trying to eliminate eggs, butter, cheese, milk, and meat from your diet before any fresh spring foods are available, as was sometimes the case during Lenten fasts in history. Lenten fasts were a real sacrifice, which is why some areas allowed dairy and eggs and some didn't, and I'll come back to that. I'd like us to look now at what members of the early Christian church ate and how they ate it. There are a surprising number of biblical references to what and how the church ate in the first couple of generations after Jesus lived. Chapters 8 to 11 of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians gives us a broad view of how the early church viewed food and eating. In chapter 8, Paul discusses eating food that's been sacrificed to pagan idols, a common way of getting meat in one's diet, as virtually all the sacrifices involved flesh rather than fruits or grains. A problem had arisen about whether eating the meat equated with worshiping the idol, and whether therefore Christians could or could not eat sacrificial meat. Paul states that since Christians know the idols are not real, a Christian may freely eat the meat unless eating it will lead someone astray. The problem's not the meat itself, it's the potential for non-Christians to be confused by appearance versus reality. As Paul says, "If food is a cause of their falling, I will never eat meat, so that I may not cause one of them to fall." Paul continues on in chapter 10 by saying that one should eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the grounds of conscience, for the earth and its fullness are the Lord's. If an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any questions. Notice how this is both a breaking away from the Jewish kosher laws and a separation of the church from the customs of its Jewish neighbors. And this is one of the things that helps the Christian church become a separate church and not just another Jewish sect in the eyes of the Roman authorities. Chapter 11 of the letter contains the crux of the matter, directly connecting Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, and the agape meals that used to follow in the early church. And just as a parenthetical, in some sense still do follow. I think that coffee hour, church picnics, and other food and fellowship times are direct descendants of the agape meal. The agape meal was a means of building community in the early church, particularly in times of persecution, a way of consolidating forces, as it were, against secular society. Baptized members of the church would celebrate Eucharist and then have a potluck dinner afterwards, with each bringing a dish to share as they were able and all the dishes being shared equally. However, sometimes this custom was more honored in the breach than the observance. Paul notes that he hears that when you come together, it is not really to take the Lord's Supper, for when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry and another goes away drunk. Why do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? This tells us that it was the custom to celebrate Eucharist in the context of a meal, reflecting or recreating the Passover meal, where Jesus instituted the custom of Eucharist. What's fascinating about this lack of correct practice in sharing equally in the agape meal is that this was in part what led to the position of deacon in the church. If you look at the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 6, you see the reason for the office of deacon. Now, during those days when the disciples were increasing in number, the Hellenists, that is, the non-Jewish converts to Christianity, complained against the Hebrews, that is, the Christians who came out of the Jewish tradition, because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. And the 12 gathered around the whole community of disciples and said, "It is not right that we should neglect the word of God in order to wait on tables. Therefore, friends, select from among yourselves 7 men of good standing, whom we may appoint to this task." The role of the deacon, then as now, is to speak up for the marginalized, and especially those who are lacking in the basic necessities of life. And it arose in part because some people were being selfish at the church picnic and hogging the best dishes for themselves. I want to talk about Eucharist here because it's come up several times, and it will continue to do so when we talk about feasting and fasting. And we'll see here in the slides a couple of interpretations of Eucharist in different communities. Eucharist or communion is the consecration and consumption in community of bread and wine in memory of Jesus' sacrifice for the salvation of humanity. It's very important here to emphasize in community. Eucharist is not an individual thing. It's something done with companions, those who share bread, or in this case, the bread. The second idea to note ties in with what I said earlier, that Eucharist is a direct reflection of the Jewish custom of blessing bread and wine at the start of every meal. Bread and wine were totally mundane things in the Greco-Roman world. You might pour out a libation to a god at the start of a meal, but you certainly didn't use bread and wine for a large offering to the gods, much less identifying them with God. You offered your best sheep or bullock or goat to God. So the identification of bread and wine as sacramental objects was rather scandalous, to say the least. A third important point, which will come back later when we're talking about the Middle Ages, is this, and I'm going to quote here from Flandrin and Montanari's Food. Quote, "By making bread and wine sacred, and by adopting oil as a sacramental substance par excellence, Christianity reinforced Roman food models and transmitted them to the generations that followed. At the same time, the deconsecration of meat turned it into an everyday food." End quote. Now, I take exception to the idea that meat became an everyday food because, of course, for most people, it wasn't. Your live animal is worth much more to you for its lifelong products of eggs, milk, wool, or whatever than it is as a food source. Nevertheless, the idea that non-meat things are sacramental and meat is not is a 180-degree shift in thinking, and that will keep coming back, especially as Christianity butts heads with people like the Germans and the Scandinavians, the warrior cultures who ate meat on a regular basis. And since we're on the topic of Eucharist, this is as good a time as any to mention the Great Leavened, Unleavened Bread Debate. Even though it didn't really become a big issue until the Orthodox Catholic schism in the 11th century. I've said that Eucharist comes out of the Passover meal, detailed in Exodus 12. That meal specifies the use of unleavened bread. So this tells us that the Hebrews and their Christian descendants ate leavened bread at least part of the time, since unleavened bread is specified for this meal. And indeed, we see this in the preparations for the Passover, where all leavening has to be removed from the household. The Hebrews mainly relied on a sourdough-type yeast starter transferred from batch to batch of bread, which they had learned from the Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians invented, sort of, leavened bread, perhaps by accident when wild yeast contaminated bread dough and allowed it to rise. Egyptian cooks learned to add a portion of dough from a risen batch to a new one to cause it to rise too. The Hebrews adopted the Egyptian techniques, and then the Romans carried the making of leavened bread to all the parts of their world. Where this becomes important to us is in communion bread, which in the West has traditionally been unleavened, since the institution of the Eucharist took place during the Passover meal and therefore would have used unleavened bread. Modern communion wafers unfortunately more closely resemble styrofoam than pita bread or matzah, So many communities have tried making their own communion bread, both historically and in the present time. Some communities have also argued that since what Jesus used was simply the common bread of the era, what should be used for Eucharist is whatever's common in this time and place, rather than being slaves to tradition. What actually gets used for communion differs, and attitudes have ranged from anything goes to if it's not unleavened, it's not proper communion. And although that may seem like a silly thing to debate, at one point it did become a huge theological discussion. The sticking point is this: virtually all leavening agents which help bread to rise also predispose the risen bread to a quick end through mold. Christ's body theologically is and must be incorruptible. Therefore, moldy bread or anything that leads to moldy bread is not and cannot be Christ's body. This is generally the position that the Western Church has taken. The Orthodox churches, on the other hand, use leavened bread for communion because the risen bread is the symbol of Christ's resurrection. It will be interesting to see, as parts of the church relax a bit on what constitutes proper bread, if at some point there's a meeting of the minds across this schism, or at least if people will be willing to say, you know, there's justification for both sides, to each her or his own. Now let's move from Eucharist, the great feast, to the topic of feasting and fasting in general. Pretty much all religions through time have had times of feasting and times of fasting. So the Jewish traditions and the Christian traditions are not doing anything different by having such times. The original Jewish fast days, for reasons I don't know, are the modern Monday and Thursday. Christians moved those fast days to Wednesday and Friday because, according to Christian tradition, Judas sold Jesus to the Sanhedrin for 30 pieces of silver on Wednesday, and Jesus was crucified on Friday. Now, I myself think, as an anthropologist, that change actually came first as the Christian church tried to distinguish itself from its Jewish roots, and then the reason for the changes was backfilled from biblical texts, but that's my own research opinion. In any event, the Christian church distinguished itself pretty fast, like within 2 or 3 generations, by some of its attitudes toward food and fasting. A quote here again from the Food Encyclopedia. Although the Gospels recommended that all food should be accepted as a gift from God, renouncing meat, the symbol of death, physicality, and sexuality, was a cardinal point of monastic spirituality from the dawn of Christianity. The food of hermits, ideally eaten raw to symbolize their rejection of the world and its civilization, was the image of paradise lost. Now, it's important to remember, once again, that most people already had a largely vegetarian diet, and that meat was often an add-in rather than the full meal. But it's also the case that for most people, the basic cooking implement was the cauldron, and you just kept throwing in whatever you had. So you might still have bits of Sunday's chicken lurking in the pot on Thursday, and that makes life difficult if you're supposed to be avoiding meat on Wednesday and Friday. I suspect that for a great many people, except for the fasts of Advent and Christmas, fasting was more honored in the breach than the observance. And I should note here that for most of Christianity, fasting has meant the avoidance of certain foods and not necessarily abstaining from all food for a period of time. But it's also the case that as Christianity became first the state religion under Constantine, and then for many people the only source of education and authority, that the church exerted a fair amount of influence on what did and did not get eaten, and when it was or was not eaten. And if that meant cleaning out the cooking pot twice a week, well, that's the sacrifice you make for Jesus. Records for what ordinary people ate are pretty spotty, from roughly the 6th century to the late Middle Ages, so we have to go mostly with what was eaten in the monasteries. Ray Tannehill notes, there's a serious hiatus in food records between Roman times and the 12th century, and for once the food of the rich is almost as inadequately documented as that of the poor. Luckily, we do have a really good source for monastic meals, particularly in the Rule of Benedict, about which we'll talk in a moment. Here's a quote from Tannehill's book regarding monastic food in the Middle Ages. On Sundays and holy days, eggs, cheese, and small fish were added to the mainly vegetarian dishes. On fast days, and by the 9th century there were more than 200 of them a year, only one meal was allowed, and that had to be vegetarian. The quality of fast day meals improved considerably as the monasteries began to acquire grants of land and fishing rights. Previously, fish had not been considered a fast day food. But by the 10th century, many monasteries were able to boast a vivarium in which captured fish swam until they were needed in the kitchen. The very existence of this vivarium shows that fish had become of real and regular importance. Although the first literary reference to a fast day dish of fish dates from the 12th century, fish had become a fast day food long before then. It had even become one of the two rather flexible standards, the other being not meat, against which other fast day foods were measured. Frogs and beavers were classified as fish. Fetal rabbit and suckling pig were classified, like eggs, as not meat. Now again, fasting varied according to time and place. You can't talk about a Lenten fast as if it's a one-size-fits-all deal. Some places ate fish and some didn't. Some regions used no animal products at all. Some allowed eggs or cheese or milk. And of course, people being people, all kinds of cheating went on, especially as the church became top-heavy with noble sons who entered the church as a business rather than from vocation and brought their eating habits with them. Cosman, in Fabulous Feasts, gives us the following rundown. Walrus, seal, porpoise, dolphin, and various whales, although mammals, were classified as fish in the Middle Ages, along with crayfish, crab, lobster, mussels, oysters, scallops, shrimp, and whelks. Clever or ingenious clerics and laymen secured their favorite meats by tampering with natural history. The well-favored barnacle goose, forbidden flesh if a mere goose, was often permitted during Lent because barnacles were classified as fish. Regardless of the type of fast, it's quite correct that for much of Christian history, people were fasting in some form or another for about half the year. Between Martyrs' Days, Wednesday and Friday fasts, the 40 days of Lent, and the Advent fast, which was 28 or 40 days, depending upon where you were, a good estimate is that anywhere between 150 and 180 days a year were fast days. Tannehill's estimate of 200 plus days a year is a bit too high. A couple of other points on the church's influence on food. We know that after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Roman Catholic Church and its monasteries preserved and advanced the knowledge of grape growing and practice of winemaking in Europe because they needed a reliable source of communion wine. And as food historian Richard Foss has noted, the church in the last century was able to get around prohibition in this country for exactly the same reason, the need for sacramental wine. The more things change, the more they stay the same. The church also learned to use food as a way of subduing or subsuming barbarian cultures once they were converted to Christianity. In the diet of the powerful, meat was still the symbol of power. Thus, in Carolingian times, the misdeeds of the powerful were often punished by the obligation to abstain from eating meat for a short or a long period of time. Is it any wonder then that four-footed meat was forbidden in Lenten and Advent fasts, when one was supposed to concentrate on God's power and glory rather than one's own, and also on the literal incarnation or enfleshment of Jesus? So having noted briefly how the church influenced what people ate, let's look at how the church itself was eating. We have a relative wealth of information on monastic food traditions, and I'd like us to take a look at the rule of Saint Benedict. Benedict lived from about 480 to 547, and his rule of life for monks and nuns living in community is a model of moderation, especially for the time, and especially in light of the view that raw vegetarian diet was what church hermits should be aspiring to. Remember that the church has fought a constant battle, rightly or wrongly, against the sins of the flesh and the evils inherent in paying attention to bodily needs. Note that this is not my attitude, but it was the attitude of the church for a lot of its history. So the moderation of Benedict's rule is really rather surprising. In chapter 39, Benedict allows for 2 cooked portions of food at the daily meals, so that the person who may not be able to eat of one kind of food may partake of the other. Benedict also mandates fresh fruits and vegetables when available, and a pound of bread per monk per day. This tells us that daily meals contained both cooked and raw foods and bread. It also tells us that it had become the custom in some places and at some times to force monks to go without if they couldn't eat the cooked dish at a meal. Benedict also allows the monks half a bottle of wine each per day, unless local conditions, work, or the summer heat indicate the need for a greater amount. Benedictine monks may not have been living high on the hog, but they certainly weren't going hungry on a regular basis. Benedict also gives us good information into when the monks ate, which was pretty much when ordinary people ate. From Easter to Pentecost, there are no fast days, and the monks get to eat twice a day, at noon and before sundown. After Pentecost, Wednesdays and Fridays are fast days, as they were supposed to be for all Christians, and the main meal is taken at 3 p.m. with supper at sundown. Beginning in the middle of September and going through Easter, there's only 1 meal a day, at 3 p.m. before Lent and at sundown during Lent. The difference here between monastic tradition and secular tradition is that ordinary people would generally have continued to eat 2 meals a day except during the Lenten fast. Benedict's monks are also largely vegetarian by choice as a spiritual discipline. The most interesting thing to note here is that although this kind of discipline sounds strict to us, Benedict's rule was generally lauded in its time as a moderate rule and was in fact criticized at times for being too lax. Now we have to take a big jump over some history, in part because there's less known about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and in part because I want to talk about some of the reactions against the church's influence on food and society. As the church became powerful, abuses happened, as they do when any political body grows in power. Some of the reactions came from outside the church and some from within. Thus, we have a humorous recipe from the 15th century that is a reaction against papal and clerical abuses. Take 24 cardinals, 100 archbishops and prelates, the same number from each nation, immerse in Rhine water and keep submerged for 3 days. The resulting liquor will be good for the cure of all St. Peter's diseases. As time went on, unfortunately, many monasteries were not known for their moderation, although the Benedictines, the Trappists, and the Cistercians were generally among the better sort. Still, discipline was often more noted in the breach than the observance. Another quote here from Food. Quote, in its anxiety to renounce meat and its need to find substitutes, monastic culture ended up developing highly refined gastronomic substitutes, which provided polemicists in later centuries with the stereotypical image of the greedy monk. What kind of renunciation, commented St. Bernard in his attack on the monks at Cluny, can there be in a cuisine that possesses dozens of ways to cook eggs? What kind of penitence, noted Peter Abelard, can there be in the search for refined and skillfully prepared fish? Hagiographic sources are full of meat-eating monks, and these cases cannot be regarded as individual deviations from the rule. Rather, the culture and mentality of the late monastic world was deeply imbued with the lifestyle of the powerful. End quote. My comment to this is, well, that's true as far as it goes, but look what we have here. First, even these critics note that this is a falling away from Benedict's rule and its intentions. Second, by the late Middle Ages, most of the church's hierarchy came from the upper classes. So, of course, the upper class ways impinged on monastic traditions. Society influences the church just as the church influences society. And thirdly, I'm not convinced that the editors of food fully understand the significance of Sundays in the realm of feasting and fasting. Throughout Christian history, even in the fast periods of Advent and Lent, Sunday is a feast day. Every Sunday is a little Easter and celebrates Christ's resurrection. And just as mourning is forbidden in Jewish tradition on the seventh day, so fasting is forbidden on every Sunday of the year. So I wonder how many of these critics were looking at the Sunday meal in a monastery and assumed that's what meals were like all the time. That's definitely a source to investigate. As time passed, so too the customs of the church changed, especially after the Reformation, and this also influenced society as a whole. With the advent of Protestantism, there were fewer and fewer holidays celebrated simultaneously across Europe. And Calvinists were especially hostile to the superstitions observance of dates. In the Middle Ages, people everywhere had cooked with lard or butter on meat days and an oil on fast days. Now, however, a geographic divide grew up between countries that cooked with butter and countries that cooked with oil. Not all countries that used butter were Protestant, because in the wake of the Reformation, the Catholic Church had authorized any number of dispensations to fast days, but most Protestant countries favored butter, and the oil countries were not only Catholic, but primarily Mediterranean. A great example of the state trying to influence the church occurs in England during the reign of the Puritans. Medieval and Renaissance celebrations of Christmas were fairly well like ours today. Homes were decorated, people went to church, gifts were exchanged, and people partied. One of the traditions involved the Lord of Misrule, a person appointed for the 12 days of Christmas who oversaw games and festivities. These games often involved rituals of role reversal and possibly grew out of the old tradition of holy innocents, a monastic tradition wherein child oblates were allowed to run the monastery on December 28th, the commemoration of Herod's killing of the Jewish children. These traditions made the Puritans complain bitterly about how the festivities dishonored God and God's plans for the world. A larger issue, however, was that the celebration of Christmas became a dividing line between English Protestants and the recusant Catholic community, who saw the celebration of Christmas as a way of sneaking in devotions to Mary and the Holy Family. So when the Puritans took control of the English government in the mid-1640s, they spent 20 years trying to abolish the Christmas festivals, with varying degrees of success. This is why, by the way, Christmas in America was not a big deal in the English communities until after the Revolution. We owe a lot in this country to the waves of European immigrants who brought their customs with them and kept them alive in this country. In any event, traditional Christmas festivities, including feasting and presents, did not return to England until Charles II ascended in 1660s. And then, as often happens, the pendulum swung back and forth, with some people seeing Christmas as a religious holiday, best served by charity and church services, and some holding that it was a holiday for making merry and overindulgence. You can see Charles Dickens trying to balance these attitudes in his own time, if we quickly jump forward another 200 years or so. I want to point out two passages from A Christmas Carol that illustrate between them the struggle between sacred and secular. The whole book is a parable on the Christian morals that Dickens associates with Christmas: generosity, kindness, universal love for one's fellow human beings. It also illustrates the modern idea of Christmas as a time for rejoicing and sharing gifts, rather than the more solemn Puritan ideas of church-going and sobriety. This is why the ghost of Christmas present sits upon a throne of food. Heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. Sounds lovely. However, Dickens was also striving to show that those celebrating need to remember those who are less fortunate and help them along, rather than making life harder. This is why there's that odd conversation between Scrooge and the ghost of Christmas Present about depriving the poor of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all. This is a reference to the attempt via the Sabbath observance bills in Parliament to re-solemnize Sundays by shutting most places of businesses, including bake shops. Believe it or not, most people in Victorian England still didn't have a full kitchen. They relied on public bakers to cook their dinners for a small fee. And the church wanted, at one point, to close down the public bakers because it profaned the Sabbath to have work done. Sometimes the church is very short-sighted, and Dickens was neither the first nor the last person to point this out. Now let's make a big jump forward in time again and talk about the last 100 years or so. I want to talk about the modern intersection of food and faith, and whether, in fact, there still is any intersection at all. Does anyone still fast in the 50 years since Vatican II? Or is all this just a nice antique view of what we all used to do? In fact, fasting, feasting, and the intersection of religion and society are very much alive and well even today. I think we're still fascinated by food consumption as a marker of spirituality, even people who don't themselves practice that kind of tradition. All we have to do is look at articles on the internet, the fast food restaurants, and TV and movies to see the impact that the church still has on our food lives. First of all, modern fasting. Does anyone still fast? Yes, indeed. The Episcopal, Roman Catholic, and Orthodox churches all still observe feast and fast days, though not as many as in the Middle Ages, thank God. The Book of Common Prayer for the Episcopal Church, which is the tradition I know best, lists the following days as to be observed by special acts of discipline and self-denial: Ash Wednesday and all weekdays of Lent and Holy Week except the Feast of the Annunciation, Good Friday and all Fridays of the year in commemoration of the Lord's crucifixion, except the Fridays in Christmas and Easter and any feast of the Lord which may occur on a Friday. So for 2021, we're talking roughly 75 days in the calendar year, not 175. Note also that these days are to be observed by acts of discipline and self-denial, which may or may not include food fasting. In fact, the only 2 days of the year mandated as fast days in the Episcopal Church are Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. And the only day on which a priest may not consecrate the elements of communion is Good Friday, making it, in effect, a spiritual and temporal fast day. We also see holdovers from feasts and fasts in our supermarkets and fast food restaurants. As I mentioned, Catholics have not been required to abstain from meat on Fridays since Vatican II. One is allowed to substitute good works or another form of penance instead of abstaining from meat. And yet McDonald's still puts its Filet-O-Fish sandwiches on sale during Lent. It's a holdover that may never die, especially if they continue to make money at it. Put a mental note in your calendar to check out your local McDonald's next month and see for yourself. Similarly, one sees hot cross buns in the markets all during Lent, though they used to be restricted to Holy Week. People like them, so they eat them, regardless of whether they otherwise follow Christian traditions. One can also see or order specially seminal cakes for the fourth Sunday in Lent, known variously as Refreshment Sunday or Mothering Sunday. In Britain, girls in service would go home and visit their mothers on this Sunday, often bearing sweet cakes as a gift. We are not in Britain, but simnel cakes are still hanging around, although they're harder to find than hot cross buns. And what football party is complete without beer and pretzels? Yep, both associated with the church. Although the myth about a German monk inventing the pretzel to demonstrate the position of prayer to children is probably just that, a myth. Pretzels have, however, been a symbol of the church since at least the 12th century, and were a common Lenten staple in Germany. And beer. Let me tell you about a modern beer fast, proof that inquiry is alive and well today. One of the more unusual facets of fasting is the Lenten beer fast, reportedly practiced by 17th century German monks. A man named J. Wilson, a home brewer and a practicing Roman Catholic, decided in 2012 to try to recreate the beer made and used by the monks of Neudeck ob der Au near Munich, the beer that Wilson believed was the origin of Doppelbock beer. Wilson had found documents that indicated these particular monks had lived only on this beer and water for the duration of Lent. So he worked with the head brewer at Rock Bottom Restaurant and Brewery in Des Moines, Iowa, to try and replicate the monks' formula. During Lent in 2012, Wilson drank 4 beers a day during the work week, with the permission of his employer, and 5 beers a day on the weekends. He checked in regularly with his doctor during that time to make sure he didn't suffer any serious side effects. He discovered that sure enough, the caloric intake from the unfiltered beer and the vitamins and minerals he received from it were enough to keep him going. He lost 25 pounds, or just under 4 pounds a week, but he remained basically healthy, with only a slight protein deficit at the end. Needless to say, this fast got lots and lots of publicity, along with a big boost in beer sales for Rock Bottom. So we have here a modern interest in and verification of a quite extreme Lenten fast. We also still have all the traditions surrounding pancakes and soul cakes. Bridget Hennish in the Medieval Calendar Year describes a page from a 16th century French book of Hours, which shows a cheerful scene of eating and drinking by a fire where pancakes are being made. This is probably a representation of the Shrove Tuesday practice of using up all the dairy products and eggs and the larder before the Lenten fasts. And one of the most practical ways of doing this is fritters and pancakes. This custom was obviously well established by the time of this manuscript, and there's a tribute in the book to the day whereon both rich and poor are chiefly feasted from the selfsame dish, when every paunch till it can hold no more is fritter filled, as well as heart can wish. Many Episcopal and Roman Catholic churches still hold pancake suppers on Shrove Tuesday, although the point now is usually the fellowship of the evening and sometimes fundraising, rather than a mandatory need to consume every egg and pat of butter in sight. Soul cakes are an even more ancient tradition, which is certainly documented to pre-Reformation Britain, and it's probably a holdover from the Druidic tradition of grave offerings for the dead at Samhain or modern Halloween. After Britain converted to Christianity, young people continued to go through the villages on All Saints and All Souls, singing and collecting cakes for the dead. The soul cakes were originally either collected for distribution to the poor or given as grave offerings, but as time went on, they were eaten by the soulers themselves, rather like modern Halloween candy. And this may be one of the origins of the custom of trick-or-treating. Going souling was practiced in parts of England at least through the 1950s, and the tradition still fascinates people today. Sting released a version of the traditional souling song on his 2009 album, If on a Winter's Night, with the lyrics, a soul cake, please good missus, a soul cake. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, and 3 for him who made us all. Look at how the lyrics have morphed over the years to reflect Christmas rather than Hallowmass or All Souls. I don't know for sure if this is evidence that the church is still unconsciously influencing traditions today, or if it's just an example of the original meaning getting lost over time and the song being grafted into the Christmas tradition. Finally, one of the traditions that I find most fascinating, sin eating. Sin eaters have been mentioned in literature since at least the 17th century. In a letter by John Bagford, who lived from 1650 to 1716, the custom is noted as being of long standing. The 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica states that a symbolic survival of sin eating was seen in 1893 in Shropshire, and also talks about sin eating in Bavaria and the Balkan Peninsula. The most commonly cited source for the custom of sin eating is Bertram Puckle's 1926 book, Funeral Customs, and I'd like to give you quite a long quote here. A less known but even more remarkable functionary, whose professional services were once considered necessary to the dead, is the sin eater. Savage tribes were known to slaughter an animal on the grave in the belief that it would take upon itself the sins of the dead. In the same manner, it was the province of the human scapegoat to take upon himself the moral trespasses of his client in return for a miserable fee and a scanty meal. That such a creature would be unearthed from a remote period of pagan history would be surprising enough, but to find reliable evidence of his existence in the British Isles 100 years ago is surely very much more remarkable." End quote. Howlett mentions sin eating as an old custom in Hereford and describes the practice. The corpse being taken out of the house and laid on a bier, a loaf of bread was given to the sin eater over the corpse, also a bowl of maple full of beer. These being consumed, a fee of 6 pence was given him for the consideration of his taking upon himself the sins of the deceased, who thus freed would not walk after death. Howlett suggests the connection between the sin eater and the Jewish scapegoat of the Old Testament. There's definitely a connection here between the scapegoat and the sin eater, but I'd also like to point out that sin eating is an interesting reflection of Eucharist itself. It's almost always bread and alcohol, whether beer or wine, that is offered the sin eater. The bread is placed on or passed over the corpse, thereby taking on the form of the deceased, and the sin eater then takes it into himself and incarnates it, just as the Christian tradition believes happens during Eucharist. We joke about "you are what you eat," but that's definitely the belief about Eucharist, and it seems to hold true for sin eating as well. Sin eaters continue to fascinate us decades after the last official sin eater died. Official meaning they've been referenced in a respectable publication, because there may be remnants of the custom occurring even today. Sin eaters are major characters in several novels from the last 20 years, including one published just last year. Likewise, sin eaters have appeared in at least 4 movies in the last 20 years, was in the television show Night Gallery in 1972, and the most recent example I can find was in the show Sleepy Hollow, which ran from 2013 to 2017. A major character in Sleepy Hollow was both a sin eater and one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse from the book of Revelation. I don't know if the creators of Sleepy Hollow knew all the background of sin eating, but I find it secretly amusing that the horseman of war should also be a sin eater. It seems kind of like a way of ensuring your own future food supply by racking up the corpses of people who died suddenly. I do wish, however, that those who are attracted to sin eating understood more about the tradition, because so often they get basic aspects wrong. In 2019, in the episode Deadly Sins of Morgan Freeman's series, The Story of God, Freeman discussed the story of England's last sin eater, Richard Munslow, who died in 1906. A supposed expert on sin eaters notes that Munslow loses his soul to save the town, and then shows the man's gravesite, complete with an elaborate grave marker in the churchyard. Sorry, if his soul were lost, he would not have been buried in the churchyard. One of the whole points of sin eating was that the living sin eater could make confession, as the corpse obviously could not, and rid himself of the sins he had taken on. I have a similar issue with the 2020 novel Sin Eater, where those who take on the role of sin eater are forbidden to talk once they've been initiated. Again, that defeats the purpose of being able to make confession, but it does make for an interesting twist in the story. It seems clear to me that while some aspects of traditional religious customs have declined over time, many of them are alive and well today, either as direct descendants of earlier customs or readaptations and reinterpretations of older models. Obviously, I've only been able to scratch the surface of many of these topics, so I do hope you'll look through the resource list and use it to further your own knowledge. I'd like to thank the Culinary Historians of San Diego for allowing me to give this lecture. I hope you've enjoyed this little tour of 2,000 years of food traditions, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Fascinating. We do have some questions from a couple people here. Oh, also, and the reading list has been posted on our website. So if you go to the event page for today's event, there is a PDF download, so you can grab that. I have a question from Ed. Was the consumption of alcoholic beverages a way to avoid drinking water that might be impure?
Absolutely. And throughout a lot of history, because if you're boiling the water to make beer, then you're boiling away some of the impurities.
Mhm. All right. Tracy is asking, did I understand that 2 meals per day, Benedictine, were at noon and 3?
No, sorry if I stumbled through my words. For part of the year, the meals were at noon and sundown, and for part of the year, generally at 3 and sundown, if they're eating 2 meals a day. When it's 1 meal a day during Lent, the meal was at either 3 or sundown, depending.
Okay. All right, that answers that. Um, Barbara is asking, wouldn't the use of butter versus oil have to do with countries having the ability to raise dairy animals versus those without pasture land, but a climate ideal for olive groves?
It's a both and situation. Definitely, yes, there was a predisposition in some places toward using oil. But as some of the experts have noted, it became a marker of whether you were Protestant or whether you were Catholic. And so some places which still had butter moved to the use of oil more exclusively, and vice versa.
All right. Tracy asks, can the beer fast beer recipe be found somewhere?
I don't know. It was not in the article about the beer fast, but I promise that if I dig it up, I will let people know.
I'm gonna look into that too. That sounds interesting. We'll
Oh,
figure it out. We'll find it.
oh.
Suzanne asks, well, actually, she just says, thank you very much for an excellent program. Uh, Anna Powell, I'm curious about the baby in king cakes. How are they a reminder of Lent?
Right. And then there's I see also a follow-on question on how did the king cakes from the Three Kings become a Mardi Gras tradition?
Yes.
And that I can actually try to answer those together.
All right then.
The season of Epiphany goes from January 6th, which is the traditional date of the Three Kings giving gifts to Jesus, and goes all the way to Ash Wednesday. And Epiphany often extended the season of partying for Christmas, bearing cakes. And one of the traditions was to put a baby or a symbolic baby in the king's cake. Uh, Part of the tradition was that if you got the baby, you had to provide the cake the next year. As time went on, the king's cake moved closer and closer and closer to Mardi Gras. So now it's really a Mardi Gras tradition rather than a tradition throughout the whole Epiphany season. And so the idea of the baby changed too, that if you get the baby in king's cake at Mardi Gras, it's just the reminder of your coming reminder of mortality on Ash Wednesday, and the baby to whom the cakes were originally given.
There you go. Roxanne asks, a missionary to the Inuit in Greenland translated the Lord's Prayer as, give us this day our daily seal, since they had no concept of bread.
Oh, interesting.
It's actually, yeah, there you go. Um, Kath asks, did the shift to bread and wine as sacred partially occur to allow those from the lower classes to participate versus limiting it to those of the upper classes that had ready access to meat for offerings?
Uh, Interesting idea. I suspect that yes, that was partly the case because bread and wine were available to everyone. And certainly, since Eucharist was supposed to be available to everyone, that would be a way of evening the dish, as it were. I suspect too that it's just an idea of, as I said, making the formerly non-sacramental sacramental, sacramentalizing all of life rather than just just the time when you can get festival meat.
Yeah, makes more sense. And Elizabeth asks, I'm sure there are beer historians who can help with the beer recipe for the beer fast. I know that bread historian William Rubel has information about yeast, including brewer's yeast, so he may be able to help find that recipe.
That would be
Thank
great.
you, Elizabeth. There you go. Also, I see we have something else. Meg says king cake is eaten at parties, at home, and at work, breakfast, dessert, or snack.
Cool.
And Philippa says we still eat simnel cakes in the UK.
Hey.
And Meg says I live in Louisiana. We eat king cake January 6th, Mardi Gras.
Cool. So then it's
There you
still
go.
it's still for the full season in places that really do Mardi Gras. It's good to
Oh,
know.
and Richard is online here. He says, with regard to beer, the beer used for Beer Fest, I suggest A Sip Through Time, a collection of old beer recipes. Thank you, Richard.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's all for the questions. If anybody has any other questions, it's now or never. Thank you so much for joining us. There is one more. What was used for the communion wine for common people in areas where wine was expensive?
Really good question. I would imagine that it was the moral equivalent of rot gut, because it was definitely wine wherever you were. And I suspect that, wealthy people had a somewhat better cup of wine than the poorer people had.
Mhm. Whatever could be found, most
Whatever could be
probably.
found.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And our next show will be next month on the 20th, and we'll be having Christina Sleeper, and this show here will be it has been recorded, and we will be posting that online. And we'll see you all next month. And thank you so much again for sharing your vast knowledge on this fascinating subject.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And see you all later. Thank you so much.